The gray horse burst out of the trees like something running from a fire, and Clara Bennett dropped the basket of apples in her hands before she even understood what she was looking at. Its reins were torn. Its saddle hung sideways, slipping toward its belly with every wild stride. Foam gathered at the corners of its mouth, and its eyes were wide with a fear that made Clara's chest tighten instantly. She did not think. She did not calculate the danger. She simply ran toward the frightened animal, her skirt catching on the low branches of the orchard, her heart pounding harder than it had in years. "Easy," she called out, her voice steady even though her hands were shaking. "Easy now. Nobody is going to hurt you." The horse skidded to a halt only a few feet from her, its powerful chest heaving, its nostrils flaring with every breath. For a moment Clara thought it might bolt again, might vanish back into the trees and be lost forever to whoever owned it. But something in her voice, low and calm and unafraid, seemed to reach through the animal's panic. It stood still, trembling, watching her with one wary eye. Clara had grown up around horses. Her father had kept 2 plow horses for as long as she could remember, gentle old creatures with soft eyes and slow tempers, nothing like the animal standing before her now. This horse was different in every way that mattered. Its coat, even dirtied with sweat and dust, held a silver sheen that caught the afternoon light. Its legs were long and lean, built for speed rather than labor. The saddle, though torn loose and hanging crooked, was made of leather so fine that Clara had never touched anything like it in her life. Even damaged, it looked like something meant for a person of great importance. She took one slow step forward, then another, her palm open and steady in front of her. "You've had a fright, haven't you?" she murmured. "Somebody's going to be looking for you. Let's see if we can't get you settled first." The horse flinched at her nearness but did not run. Clara reached up carefully and let her fingers brush against its neck. The muscles beneath the skin were rigid with tension, but slowly, as she kept speaking in that same low and steady voice, she felt them begin to loosen. She had always had a gift for calming frightened animals, though she had never thought much of it before. Her mother used to say that Clara could talk a storm into stillness if she wanted to. Today, for the first time, she understood what her mother meant. It took nearly 10 minutes before the horse allowed her to touch its face, and another 5 before it let her examine the wound she had noticed on its front leg, a shallow cut just above the knee, already crusted with dried blood but not deep enough to be dangerous. Still, it would need cleaning. Left alone, it could easily become infected, and an infection in a leg like that could end a fine horse's usefulness forever. Clara glanced around the orchard, half expecting to see someone running after the horse, a rider or a groom calling out in alarm. But there was no one. Only the quiet hum of insects in the afternoon heat, the distant bleating of her neighbor's goats, and the soft rustle of leaves overhead. Whoever had been riding this horse, whoever owned it, was nowhere in sight. She looked closer at the saddle, running her hands along the leather, searching for some mark, some symbol, some clue that might tell her where this animal belonged. There was fine stitching along the edges, a pattern of vines and small flowers worked into the leather with obvious skill, but no initials, no crest, no name. The bridle was the same, beautiful, expensive, anonymous. "Well," Clara said softly, resting her hand on the horse's neck, "it seems neither of us knows who you belong to." The horse huffed, as if in agreement, and lowered its head slightly, allowing her to scratch gently beneath its mane. Clara found herself smiling despite the strange circumstance. There was something almost comical about the situation. A farm girl standing in the middle of an orchard with apples scattered at her feet, holding the reins of a horse that clearly belonged to someone far above her station. But the smile faded quickly as she thought about what to do next. She could not simply leave the animal here, injured and frightened, in the hope that its owner might wander by. Nor could she leave it tied to a tree and walk away, not when it was clearly distressed and clearly valuable. Whoever had lost this horse would be searching for it, and searching hard. A horse like this did not belong to a farmer or a merchant. It belonged to someone with money, someone with influence, someone who would not simply shrug off its disappearance. Clara thought of the road that ran along the edge of the village, the one that connected Hollow Brook to the larger towns beyond. And eventually, though she had never traveled that far herself, to the grand estate that sat on the hill 3 miles north. She had seen it only from a distance, a great house of pale stone with tall windows that caught the sunlight like mirrors, surrounded by gardens so vast that the whole of her family's farm could have fit inside them twice over. She had heard stories about the man who lived there, the Duke, though she had never once laid eyes on him. People spoke of him with a mixture of respect and distance, as though he existed in a different world entirely, one that never touched the ordinary lives of people like her. Could this horse belong to him? The thought seemed almost absurd, and yet nothing about the animal suggested otherwise. Its breeding, its equipment, the quality of everything about it pointed toward wealth far beyond anything Clara had ever encountered. She looked down at the wound on its leg again, then back toward her family's small house at the far end of the orchard, its chimney sending up a thin curl of smoke into the afternoon sky. Her mother would be inside, likely mending clothes by the window. Her father would be out in the far field, tending to the last of the harvest before the weather turned. There was no one to ask for advice, no one to tell her what the right thing to do might be. So Clara decided for herself. She would not leave the horse to wander alone, injured and afraid, hoping that some stranger might find it before harm came to it. And she would not simply lead it to the village and hand it over to whoever happened to be standing nearby, not without knowing more about where it had come from or who might be searching for it. Instead, she would walk it herself, slowly and carefully, toward the road, and from there toward the town, where surely someone would recognize such a fine animal and be able to point her in the right direction. It was not a small decision. The walk to town would take hours, and the day was already stretching toward late afternoon. Her chores at home would go unfinished. Her mother would worry when she did not return before dark, but Clara could not bring herself to consider any other option. The horse trusted her now in its own frightened, uncertain way, and she felt a responsibility toward it that she could not easily set aside. She spent a few more minutes fixing the saddle as best she could, tightening the straps that had come loose, adjusting the girth so it would not slip again during the walk. Her hands moved with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years around animals, even if this one was far grander than anything she had ever handled before. The horse stood patiently through it all, occasionally nudging her shoulder with its nose, as though it too understood that she was trying to help. "There," Clara said finally, stepping back to look at her work. "That should hold well enough until we find someone who knows where you belong." She gathered the reins carefully into her hand, testing the horse's willingness to be led. It hesitated for only a moment before falling into step beside her, its great head lowered slightly, its earlier panic replaced now by a kind of weary trust. Clara felt a small swell of pride at that, though she quickly reminded herself that the real work was still ahead. The road to town was long, the horse was still favoring its injured leg slightly, and the afternoon sun was already beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. Before setting off, Clara glanced once more toward her home, weighing whether she should stop and tell her mother where she was going. But time felt precious now, and every minute she spent explaining herself was a minute the horse's owner spent searching frantically, perhaps fearing the worst. She decided she would explain everything once she returned. For now, the most important thing was getting the horse to safety and finding whoever was missing it. They set off together, girl and horse, moving slowly along the narrow path that wound through the orchard and out toward the main road. The apples she had dropped lay forgotten in the grass behind her, along with the basket that had once held them. None of that mattered now. What mattered was the animal beside her, its breathing gradually steadying, its steps growing more confident with every passing minute. As they walked, Clara found herself talking to the horse in a low, easy voice, the same way she might talk to any of the animals on her family's farm. She told it about the orchard, about the apples she had been gathering, about the quiet rhythm of her days spent tending crops and helping her mother with the household chores. She did not know if the horse understood any of it, but the sound of her voice seemed to keep it calm, and that was enough. "You must belong to someone important," she said at one point, running her free hand along its neck as they walked. "Nobody puts saddle work like that on just any horse. Somebody cares about you very much, and they're probably worried sick right now." The horse turned its head slightly at the sound of her voice, its dark eyes watching her with what almost looked like understanding. Clara smiled and kept walking, though a small knot of worry had begun to form in her stomach. What if she could not find the owner before nightfall? What if the horse's injury worsened along the way? What if she encountered trouble on the road, alone with an animal that clearly did not belong to her, and someone assumed the worst about her intentions? She pushed the thoughts aside as best she could. There was no use borrowing worry from a future that had not yet arrived. All she could do was keep walking, keep the horse calm, and trust that somewhere along the road, someone would recognize the animal and point her toward its rightful owner. The path eventually widened into the main road, the packed dirt giving way to a slightly better maintained surface that had clearly seen the passage of carts and carriages over the years. Clara paused at the junction, looking first toward the village in one direction, then toward the distant hills in the other, where she knew the grand estate sat perched above the countryside like a watchful sentinel. For a moment she considered heading straight toward the estate itself. If the horse truly belonged to the Duke, surely that would be the fastest way to return it. But the estate was miles away, farther than the village, and the horse was already tired and hurt. She could not ask it to walk that far without rest, not when the village was so much closer and might offer information that could shorten the journey considerably. She chose the village. The decision made, Clara adjusted her grip on the reins and continued walking, the horse falling into step beside her once more. The afternoon sun hung lower in the sky now, casting long shadows across the road ahead of them, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of a church bell marking the hour. Time was slipping away, and with it, the daylight she would need to complete her journey safely. But Clara did not turn back. She had made her choice, and she intended to see it through, whatever the evening might bring. As they walked further from the orchard, the landscape began to change around them. The neat rows of fruit trees gave way to open fields, some freshly harvested, others still golden with unpicked grain swaying gently in the breeze. Farmers dotted the distant landscape, bent over their work, and a few glanced up as Clara and the horse passed by, their expressions shifting from mild curiosity to open surprise when they registered the quality of the animal beside her. One older man, leaning on a wooden fence at the edge of his property, called out as they approached, "That's a fine-looking horse for a farm girl to be leading, if you don't mind me saying." Clara offered a polite smile, though she did not slow her pace. "It's not mine," she called back. "I found it running loose near my family's orchard. I'm trying to find whoever it belongs to." The man's eyebrows rose, and he pushed himself off the fence to get a better look as they passed. "Looks like something out of a duke's stable, that does. You be careful, young miss. Fine animals like that usually mean fine trouble for whoever's holding the reins when questions start getting asked." His words lingered in Clara's mind long after she had left him behind, a small seed of unease planted alongside her determination. She knew he meant well, that his warning came from genuine concern rather than any desire to frighten her. But it did nothing to ease the growing awareness that she had taken on a task far larger than she had first realized, one that could easily be misunderstood by anyone who did not know her intentions. Still, she continued forward. Turning back now, abandoning the horse somewhere along the roadside, felt impossible to her. She had made a promise, even if only to herself and to the frightened animal walking beside her, and she intended to keep it. The road stretched on, curving gently around a low hill before straightening once more toward the distant rooftops of the village. Clara could see the church spire rising above the other buildings, and beyond it, the faint outline of the market square where, on any ordinary day, she might have been running errands for her mother instead of leading a duke's horse toward an uncertain destination. The horse's steps had grown steadier as the journey continued, its earlier limp becoming less pronounced, though Clara kept a careful eye on the wound she had noticed earlier. She stopped periodically to check it, murmuring reassurances each time, and each time the horse stood patiently, allowing her the examination without protest. It seemed, in its own quiet way, to understand that she meant it no harm. As the sun continued its slow arc toward the western horizon, Clara felt the first real stirrings of worry about the hours ahead. The village was close now, close enough that she could make out individual figures moving through its streets, but she still had no idea who might recognize the horse, or how long it might take to find someone who could point her toward its true home. And beyond that lay the longer, more difficult question of what would happen once she did find the answer. Would she be believed? Would anyone take seriously the story of a farm girl who had simply found a lost horse and decided on her own to bring it back? She did not know, but she kept walking anyway, one careful step after another, the reins held firmly in her hand and the weight of an unexpected responsibility settling more deeply onto her shoulders with every passing mile. Whatever waited for her in the village, whatever answers or complications the evening might bring, Clara Bennett had already decided that she would not turn back now. The horse trusted her. That, for the moment, was enough to carry her forward into whatever came next. The village of Hollow Brook came into view slowly, its rooftops rising above a line of old oak trees, smoke curling lazily from a dozen chimneys into the softening afternoon sky. Clara had walked this road many times before, usually on errands for her mother, carrying baskets of eggs or bolts of cloth, but never once with a horse like this beside her, and never once with quite so many eyes turning to watch her pass. The first person to notice them was a boy named Freddie Marsh, no older than 10, who had been chasing a stray chicken near the edge of the village and stopped mid-stride when he caught sight of the gray horse. His mouth fell open, and for a moment he simply stared, forgetting entirely about the chicken, which took the opportunity to scurry away into a nearby hedge. "That's the biggest horse I've ever seen," Freddie said, his voice full of awe as he trotted closer, careful to keep a respectful distance. "Where did you get it, Clara?" "I didn't get it anywhere," Clara replied, offering the boy a tired but friendly smile. "I found it running loose near our orchard. I'm trying to find out who it belongs to. Have you seen anyone looking for a horse today? Riders, maybe, or someone asking questions?" Freddie shook his head, his eyes still fixed on the animal. "No, but my father might know. He's been at the market all day. Everyone talks to him." Clara thanked the boy and continued forward, though his answer offered little comfort. If no one in the village had heard anything about a missing horse, it meant either the search had not yet reached this far, or that whoever owned the animal had not yet realized just how serious the situation truly was. Either possibility left her with the same problem. She still had no clear direction to follow. As she made her way deeper into the village, more people began to notice her. A woman selling vegetables from a small cart paused mid-sale to stare. Two elderly men sitting outside the tavern lowered their mugs and exchanged glances. A group of younger women, baskets balanced on their hips, whispered to one another as Clara passed, their eyes tracking the horse with open curiosity. The attention made Clara uncomfortable, though she tried not to let it show. She kept her chin lifted and her pace steady, focusing instead on scanning the faces around her for any flicker of recognition, any sign that someone might know where this magnificent animal belonged. But recognition, when it finally came, arrived from an unexpected direction. "Well, I'll be," came a voice from the doorway of the village blacksmith's shop. Clara turned to see a broad-shouldered man wiping soot from his hands with a rag, his eyes narrowed thoughtfully at the horse. His name was Walter Higgins, and he had shod nearly every horse in the village at one point or another, though clearly never one quite like this. "You know this horse?" Clara asked, hope rising in her chest for the first time since she had begun her long walk. Walter approached slowly, running an experienced eye over the animal's build, its coat, the fine stitching of its saddle. He whistled low under his breath. "Can't say I've shod this particular one, but I know horses like it. This is estate stock, no question about that. Bred for speed, built for someone who cares more about how a horse moves than how much work it can do in a day. You don't see animals like this wandering around Hollow Brook very often." "Do you know where it might have come from?" Clara pressed. "Which estate, I mean." Walter rubbed his chin, considering. "There's only one estate around these parts grand enough to keep horses like this. Ashworth Hall, up on the northern hill, belongs to the Duke of Ashworth himself, I've heard tales of his stables, though I've never seen them with my own eyes. Word is he keeps some of the finest horses in the entire region, brought in from as far away as the coast. Clara felt a small chill run through her at the mention of the Duke's name, the same name she had heard whispered with a mixture of admiration and distance her entire life. She had never expected to find herself standing in the middle of the village with one of his horses in her care. "How far is Ashworth Hall from here?" she asked. 3 miles, maybe a bit more, north along the main road, Walter answered. "It's not a walk to take lightly, especially not with the sun already leaning toward evening. If I were you, I'd think carefully about what you want to do next." Clara glanced up at the sky, gauging the remaining daylight. Walter was right. 3 miles was no small distance, and the horse, though steadier now than when she had first found it, was still recovering from whatever ordeal had led to its escape in the first place. Pushing it further tonight, especially with its injured leg, felt like an unnecessary risk. "Is there somewhere I could leave word instead?" she asked. "Someone who might be able to send a message to the estate faster than I could walk there myself." Walter thought for a moment, then nodded toward the tavern at the center of the village square. "Old Peter Wells keeps order around here, such as it is. He's got connections up at the estate, deals with them sometimes over land matters. If anyone in Hollow Brook could get word to Ashworth Hall quickly, it'd be him." Grateful for the direction, Clara thanked Walter and led the horse toward the tavern, weaving carefully through the gathering crowd of curious onlookers who had begun to trail behind her at a respectful distance, murmuring among themselves about the strange sight of a farm girl leading a nobleman's horse through the heart of the village. Peter Wells turned out to be a stout man with graying hair and a stern but not unkind face, seated at a table near the tavern's entrance with a mug of ale and a ledger spread out before him. He looked up as Clara approached, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of the horse behind her. "That's not a village horse," he said immediately, setting down his mug. "No, sir," Clara agreed. "I found it running loose near my family's orchard this afternoon. It was injured and frightened, and I didn't want to leave it alone. Walter thinks it belongs to the Duke of Ashworth's stables." Peter's expression shifted from curiosity to something more serious. He stood, brushing off his coat, and circled the horse slowly, examining it with the careful attention of a man who understood the weight of what she had brought into his village. "Walter's right. I've seen horses from Ashworth Hall before, delivering messages and the like. This is one of theirs, no doubt about it. Fine animal, too. Duke would not take kindly to losing something like this." "That's why I came straight here," Clara said. "I was hoping you might know how to get word to the estate faster than I could walk it myself. The horse is tired, and I don't think it should travel further tonight, not with that cut on its leg." Peter studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing something in his mind. Finally, he nodded slowly. "You did the right thing bringing it here instead of trying to make the walk to the estate on your own. That road can be lonely and unpredictable once the sun starts going down, and you'd have been walking straight into unfamiliar territory with no one knowing where you'd gone. As for getting word to Ashworth Hall, I do have a way, though it will take a little time to arrange." He explained that a young man in the village occasionally carried messages to the estate in exchange for a small payment, usually running errands related to trade or land disputes between local farmers and the Duke's stewards. If Clara was willing to wait a short while, Peter could send for him and have a message dispatched within the hour. Clara agreed readily, relief washing over her at the thought that her long journey might soon come to an end. She had not realized, until that moment, just how tired she had become, both from the physical effort of the walk and from the constant, quiet worry that had accompanied her every step since first finding the horse in her family's orchard. While Peter went to arrange for the messenger, Clara led the horse to a shaded spot near the tavern's water trough, allowing it to drink deeply while she once again checked the wound on its leg. It looked no worse than before, though she made a mental note to ask whether the estate had someone skilled in treating animal injuries, someone who could properly clean and dress the cut once the horse was finally returned home. A small crowd had gathered nearby, watching with undisguised curiosity as Clara tended to the animal. Among them was an older woman named Agnes Dobbs, who ran the village's only inn and was known throughout Hollow Brook for both her sharp tongue and her genuinely kind heart. "You've caused quite a stir, girl," Agnes said, stepping closer with her arms crossed, though her eyes held more warmth than judgment. "Whole village is talking about nothing else this afternoon. Farm girl walks into town with the Duke's horse like it's the most ordinary thing in the world." Clara managed a tired smile. "I wasn't trying to cause a stir. I just didn't know what else to do. The horse was hurt and frightened, and no one came looking for it, so I thought the best thing was to bring it somewhere it could be found." Agnes studied her for a moment, then nodded approvingly. "That's more sense than most people have, if you ask me. Plenty of folks would have left it be, figuring it wasn't their problem to solve. Took some real character to walk all this way instead." She glanced toward the horse, then back at Clara. "You should come inside, rest a bit while you wait for word from the estate. No sense standing out here in the square with half the village staring at you." Clara accepted the offer gratefully, though she insisted on staying close enough to the horse that she could keep an eye on it. Agnes arranged for a bit of bread and cheese to be brought out, along with a cup of water, and Clara sat on a low bench outside the inn, finally allowing herself a moment to rest after the long, tense hours of her journey. As she ate, her thoughts turned toward home, toward her parents, who would surely be wondering where she had gone by now. She hoped they would not worry too much, though she knew her mother's imagination tended toward the dramatic whenever Clara was late returning from even the simplest errand. She resolved to explain everything as soon as she returned, though she suspected the story might sound almost unbelievable when spoken aloud. The messenger, a lean young man named George Pratt, arrived within the hour, exactly as Peter had promised. He listened carefully as Peter explained the situation, his eyes widening slightly at the mention of the Duke's missing horse, and nodded firmly before mounting his own modest horse and setting off toward Ashworth Hall at a steady pace, promising to return with word as quickly as possible. With the message sent, there was nothing left to do but wait. Clara remained near the tavern, tending to the gray horse and fielding the endless questions of curious villagers who continued to drift by throughout the afternoon, each one eager to hear the story firsthand from the young woman who had found herself, quite unexpectedly, at the center of the village's biggest excitement in months. She told the story simply and honestly each time, without embellishment, describing how she had heard the horse crashing through the trees near her family's orchard, how frightened and injured it had seemed, and how she had felt she could not simply leave it to wander alone. Most listeners nodded approvingly at her account, murmuring about her kindness and good sense, though a few voiced quiet concerns about what might happen once the Duke's people arrived, wondering aloud whether a simple farm girl might find herself facing questions or suspicions she had not anticipated. Clara tried not to let those comments trouble her too much, though a small seed of anxiety had taken root in her stomach and refused to fully disappear. She had done nothing wrong, she reminded herself. She had found an injured, frightened animal and done everything in her power to see it returned safely to its rightful owner. Surely that counted for something, whatever complications the evening might still bring. As the afternoon light began to soften into the golden hues of early evening, Clara found herself glancing repeatedly down the road toward the north, watching for any sign of George's return, or perhaps for riders sent directly from the estate itself. The horse stood patiently beside her, its earlier fear long since faded into calm trust, occasionally nudging her shoulder gently, as though sensing her growing nervousness and offering what comfort it could in return. Whatever awaited her at the end of this long, strange day, Clara knew there was no turning back now. The message had been sent. The village had witnessed everything. All that remained was to wait and to hope that her simple act of kindness would be understood exactly as she had intended it. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the rooftops of Hollow Brook when the sound of approaching horses finally reached Clara's ears. She rose quickly from the bench outside the inn, brushing crumbs from her apron, her heart quickening at the thought that word might finally be arriving from Ashworth Hall. But it was only George Pratt, riding alone, his own horse lathered with sweat from the hard pace he had kept on his journey there and back. Well, Peter Wells asked, stepping forward as George dismounted. What did they say? George caught his breath for a moment before answering, clearly eager to deliver his news. The whole estate is in an uproar. Seems the horse belongs to the Duke's personal stable, a gift he received not long ago from some foreign dignitary. His people have had riders out searching since this morning, covering every road in every direction except, as luck would have it, the one leading here. Clara felt a strange mixture of relief and unease settle over her at his words. Relief, because it confirmed that her instincts had been correct, that the horse truly did belong to someone of great importance who was desperately seeking its return. Unease, because the scale of the search George described suggested that this was a far more serious matter than she had initially understood, one that involved far more people and far greater urgency than a simple lost animal wandering into her family's orchard. "Did you tell them where the horse is now?" Clara asked, stepping closer. George nodded. "I did. Told them exactly what happened, how a young woman from Hollow Brook found it injured near her family's land and brought it into the village herself rather than leaving it to wander. The steward who received the message seemed quite surprised, though whether that surprise was good or bad, I couldn't rightly say. He thanked me for the news and said someone would be sent immediately to collect the horse and speak with whoever had found it." "Speak with me," Clara repeated, a flutter of nervousness rising in her chest. "That's what he said," George confirmed. "Seemed like they wanted to understand the full story, make sure everything was in order before bringing the horse back to the estate. Can't blame them for being careful, not with an animal as valuable as that one." Clara glanced back toward the gray horse, still standing calmly near the water trough, its earlier panic now entirely replaced by a quiet, patient stillness. She wondered briefly whether the animal understood that its long journey away from home was finally nearing its end, whether some instinct told it that safety and familiarity were close at hand once more. Peter placed a reassuring hand on Clara's shoulder, sensing her sudden nervousness. "There's nothing to worry about, girl. You've done nothing but good today. Anyone with sense will see that clearly enough once they arrive, and hear the story for themselves." Clara nodded, though the reassurance did little to fully calm the flutter of anxiety building inside her. She had never in her life expected to find herself waiting for representatives of a duke's household to arrive and question her about anything, let alone something as significant as the safe return of a valuable, well-bred horse. The weight of the situation, which had felt manageable throughout the long walk to the village, now pressed down on her with fresh intensity, as she realized just how many people had been drawn into what had begun as a simple act of concern for a frightened animal. As they waited for the estate's representatives to arrive, word continued to spread through the village, and the small crowd gathered near the tavern grew steadily larger. Neighbors who had heard the news from others came to see the remarkable sight for themselves, and soon Clara found herself surrounded by a growing gathering of familiar faces, all buzzing with curiosity and speculation about what might happen next. Her own parents arrived not long after, having finally heard through the village grapevine where their daughter had disappeared to that afternoon. Her mother, Margaret Bennett, rushed forward with obvious relief and concern mingling on her face, while her father, Henry Bennett, followed close behind, his expression more measured but no less worried. "Clara Bennett, what on earth possessed you to walk all this way with a stranger's horse?" Margaret asked, pulling her daughter into a brief, tight embrace before holding her at arm's length to look her over, as though checking for any sign of harm. "I couldn't just leave it, Mother," Clara explained, her voice steady despite the exhaustion evident in her posture. "It was hurt and frightened, and no one was coming to claim it. I thought the right thing to do was bring it somewhere it could be found and cared for properly." Henry studied the horse for a long moment, his farmer's eye taking in its fine breeding and expensive equipment with obvious understanding of its worth. "This is no ordinary animal, Clara. You do understand what you've gotten yourself involved in, don't you?" "I do now," Clara admitted. "Walter and Peter both say it belongs to the Duke of Ashworth's stables. Someone is coming from the estate to collect it and speak with me about what happened." Her parents exchanged a glance heavy with unspoken concern, though neither voiced their worry aloud in front of the gathering crowd. Instead, Margaret simply took her daughter's hand and stayed close beside her, offering silent support as they waited together for whatever the evening might bring. The wait stretched on longer than Clara had anticipated, the golden light of late afternoon gradually deepening into the softer hues of early evening. The crowd around the tavern thinned somewhat as some villagers drifted home for supper, though many remained, unwilling to miss whatever might happen once the Duke's representatives finally arrived. Children who had gathered earlier to admire the horse now sat cross-legged in small groups nearby, their earlier excitement settling into a more patient, if still curious, anticipation. Clara used the waiting time to check on the horse once more, examining the wound on its leg carefully and satisfied to find it looking no worse than before, despite the long day of walking. She spoke softly to the animal as she worked, and it responded with the same quiet trust it had shown throughout their journey together, nudging her gently with its nose as though offering its own form of gratitude for her care. "You'll be home soon," she murmured, running her hand along its neck. "Wherever home is for a horse like you, I hope they take good care of that leg once you're back." As if in response to her words, the horse let out a soft, contented sound, and Clara found herself smiling despite the nervous anticipation still churning in her stomach. Whatever complications the evening might still hold, she found herself genuinely glad, in this quiet moment, that she had chosen to help rather than walk away. It was nearly dusk when the sound of multiple horses finally reached the village, a steady rhythm of hooves growing louder as riders approached from the northern road. The crowd around the tavern stirred with renewed excitement, heads turning toward the sound, and Clara felt her heart begin to race as she watched 3 riders come into view, their horses moving at a brisk but controlled pace that spoke of urgency without recklessness. The lead rider, a middle-aged man with a stern but not unkind face, wore clothing far finer than anything typically seen in Hollow Brook, marking him immediately as someone of considerable standing within the estate's household. He brought his horse to a halt near the tavern and dismounted quickly, his eyes going immediately to the gray horse standing calmly beside Clara. "Comet," he breathed, relief evident in his voice as he approached the animal, running his hands along its neck and shoulders with obvious familiarity. "Thank heavens, we feared the worst when he didn't return with the others this morning." He turned toward Clara, his expression shifting from relief to careful assessment. "You are the young woman who found him." "Yes, sir," Clara answered, straightening slightly under his scrutiny. "My name is Clara Bennett. I found him running loose near my family's orchard this afternoon, injured and frightened. I didn't know who he belonged to, so I decided to bring him toward the village, hoping someone might recognize him." The man studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before finally extending a slight, respectful nod. "I am Mr. Whitmore, steward of Ashworth Hall. On behalf of the household, I thank you for your quick thinking and evident care. Comet's disappearance caused considerable distress this morning. His Grace has had riders searching since dawn, fearing he may have been harmed or worse." "Is he badly hurt?" Clara asked, gesturing toward the cut on the horse's leg. "I tried to clean it as best I could, but I thought it should be properly tended to by someone with more skill than I possess." Whitmore knelt briefly to examine the wound, his experienced eye assessing the injury with practiced efficiency. "A shallow cut, nothing that proper attention won't heal quickly. You did well to keep it clean during your journey. It could have been far worse had he been left to wander untreated for much longer." He straightened, studying Clara once more with an expression that had softened considerably since his arrival. "May I ask how you managed to calm him?" "Comet is known throughout the estate for his spirited temperament. It is no small thing to have gained his trust so quickly." Clara felt a flush of embarrassment at the direct question, unused to such attention. "I've always had a way with frightened animals, sir. I simply spoke to him calmly and let him understand that I meant no harm. He seemed to settle once he realized I wasn't going to hurt him." Whitmore's expression grew thoughtful as he listened, glancing between Clara and the horse with something that looked almost like genuine curiosity. "Remarkable," he murmured, more to himself than to her. His Grace will be most interested to hear the full account of today's events. He turned to one of the other riders who had accompanied him. Send word ahead that Comet has been found safe and is being returned to the estate. And note the name of the young woman responsible for his safe recovery. His Grace will wish to know. The rider nodded and immediately turned his horse back toward the northern road, spurring it into a swift gallop that quickly carried him out of sight. Clara watched him go, a fresh wave of nervousness settling over her at Whitmore's words. The idea that the Duke himself might wish to know her name, might take a personal interest in the events of the day, felt both flattering and faintly overwhelming. Whitmore turned his attention back to her, his expression once again composed and professional. Miss Bennet, on behalf of His Grace, I offer our sincere gratitude for your kindness and quick action today. It is not every day that we encounter such selfless care from a stranger, particularly one who stood to gain nothing from the effort involved. I wasn't looking for any reward, sir, Clara said honestly. I only wanted to make sure the horse was safe. Anyone would have done the same, I think. Whitmore's expression suggested he did not entirely agree with her assessment, though he did not press the point further. Instead, he gestured for one of the remaining riders to prepare Comet for the journey back to the estate, carefully checking the saddle Clara had adjusted earlier and offering a small nod of approval at her handiwork. As the preparations continued, Whitmore lingered near Clara, seemingly in no particular hurry to depart despite the fading light. Might I ask where you learned such skill with horses, Miss Bennet? Your family does not strike me as one that keeps animals of significant breeding. We keep 2 plow horses, Clara explained. Nothing like Comet, certainly, but I've always spent time with them, learned to understand their moods and needs. I suppose it's simply something that comes naturally to me, though I've never thought much about it before today. A natural gift, then, Whitmore mused, studying her with renewed interest. Such things are rare, Miss Bennet, rarer than you might realize. His Grace has struggled for some time to find handlers capable of managing Comet's more spirited moods. Perhaps you would consider— He paused, seeming to reconsider his words. Forgive me, that is a conversation for another time, and not one that is mine to offer on His Grace's behalf. For now, please accept our gratitude, and know that your kindness today has not gone unnoticed. Clara nodded, uncertain how to respond to the implication in his unfinished sentence, though a small flicker of curiosity stirred within her at the possibility he seemed to be hinting toward. Before she could ask further questions, however, Whitmore turned his attention to organizing the final preparations for their departure, and the moment for such conversation passed. As the estate's party prepared to leave with Comet, the horse turned his head one final time toward Clara, as though offering a silent farewell after their long afternoon together. She stepped forward and placed her hand gently against his nose one last time, feeling a small pang of unexpected fondness at the thought of their strange, brief companionship coming to an end. "Take care of that leg," she murmured softly, "and behave yourself so no one has cause to worry about you again." The horse huffed softly in response, and Clara smiled despite the ache of farewell settling in her chest. She watched as Whitmore mounted his own horse and the small party turned back toward the northern road, Comet moving steadily and calmly beside them, his earlier panic and fear entirely replaced by the quiet confidence of an animal finally heading home. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the deepening evening, Clara turned to find her parents watching her with expressions that mixed pride, relief, and lingering uncertainty about what the day's events might still mean for their family. The crowd of villagers began to disperse as well, many offering warm words of praise as they passed, though a few still murmured quietly among themselves about the unusual attention Clara had drawn from the Duke's household. Clara herself felt only exhaustion settling over her now that the excitement of the day had finally passed, her body aching from the long walk and her mind still turning over Whitmore's unfinished words. Whatever he had been about to suggest, whatever possibility he had hinted toward before catching himself, remained an open question hanging in the cooling evening air. She had no way of knowing, as she finally turned toward home with her parents beside her, that the day's events were far from finished, or that the quiet life she had known until now was about to change in ways she could not yet imagine. Night had fully settled over Hollow Brook by the time Clara and her parents reached their small farmhouse at the edge of the orchard, the windows glowing faintly with candlelight against the darkness outside. Clara had never felt so tired in her life, her legs aching from the long walk, her mind still spinning with everything that had happened since she first heard Comet crashing through the trees that afternoon. Her mother fussed over her the moment they stepped through the door, insisting she sit by the fire while a bowl of warm stew was prepared, and Clara did not have the energy to protest. She sank gratefully into her father's chair near the hearth, letting the warmth seep into her tired limbs while her parents moved about the small kitchen, speaking in low voices that occasionally drifted toward her. "A steward from Ashworth Hall himself," Margaret was saying, shaking her head as she stirred the pot over the fire. "Never in all my years did I imagine our Clara would be speaking with someone from the Duke's own household." "She did the right thing," Henry replied, though his tone carried a note of caution that had not been present earlier in the evening. "But I confess I'm not entirely at ease with all this attention. Fine folks up at that estate live by different rules than we do down here, Margaret. I only hope this doesn't bring complications we're not prepared for." Clara listened quietly from her chair, too exhausted to fully engage with her parents' conversation, though their words lingered in the back of her mind. She had not considered, until now, that her simple act of kindness might bring anything other than the satisfaction of knowing she had helped a frightened animal find its way home. The idea that it might carry consequences beyond that, complications her father seemed to fear, left her feeling uneasy despite her exhaustion. She ate her stew slowly, her thoughts drifting back over the events of the day, from the moment Comet had burst through the trees to the strange, unfinished suggestion Whitmore had offered before departing with the horse. She wondered what he had been about to say, what possibility he had considered mentioning before catching himself and deciding against it. The curiosity nagged at her even as sleep began to pull heavily at her eyes. She excused herself not long after finishing her meal, climbing the narrow stairs to her small room beneath the eaves and collapsing gratefully onto her bed without bothering to change from her dusty clothes. Sleep claimed her almost immediately, deep and dreamless, the exhaustion of the day finally overwhelming even the lingering questions still turning in her mind. Clara woke the next morning to the sound of her mother calling up the stairs, informing her that breakfast was ready, and that there was work to be done in the orchard before the day grew too warm. For a brief, disoriented moment, she wondered if the events of the previous day had simply been an unusually vivid dream, but the ache in her legs and the lingering scent of horse still clinging faintly to her clothes quickly reminded her that everything had been entirely real. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, finding her parents already seated at the table, though their conversation quieted the moment she appeared, suggesting they had been discussing something they did not wish her to overhear just yet. Clara took her seat without comment, though she noticed her mother's eyes lingering on her with an expression she could not quite decipher, somewhere between pride and worry. "Did you sleep well?" Margaret asked, sliding a plate of bread and cheese toward her daughter. "Better than I expected," Clara admitted. "I think I could have slept until noon if you'd let me." Henry chuckled softly at that, though the sound carried less of his usual easy humor than normal. "Well, you've earned your rest, that much is certain. Whole village is still talking about what you did yesterday. Barely got any sleep myself, thinking about it all." Clara studied her father's expression, sensing the same undercurrent of concern she had noticed the night before. "You're worried about something, father. What is it?" Henry set down his cup slowly, exchanging a brief glance with Margaret before answering. "I'm not worried, exactly. Just uncertain about what might come of all this attention. Folks like the Duke, they don't usually take much notice of people like us, not unless there's a reason. Whitmore mentioning your name to his grace directly, that steward hinting at something before he caught himself. It makes a father wonder what might be coming next." "He didn't say anything definite," Clara pointed out, though she found herself wondering the same thing if she was honest with herself. It might have been nothing at all, just a passing thought that he decided against sharing. Perhaps, Henry agreed, though his tone suggested he was not entirely convinced. Still, best to be prepared for whatever might come, whether it's something or nothing at all. The conversation drifted toward more ordinary matters after that, the day's chores and the state of the harvest, and Clara found herself grateful for the return to familiar, comfortable topics. After breakfast, she set out toward the orchard as usual, gathering the apples she had abandoned so hastily the day before, the basket still lying exactly where she had dropped it near the tree line. The work felt strangely soothing after the chaos of the previous day, the familiar rhythm of picking and sorting apples grounding her thoughts and easing the lingering tension that had followed her since waking. For a while, at least, she allowed herself to simply focus on the task at hand, pushing aside thoughts of dukes and estates and unfinished sentences that hinted at possibilities she did not yet understand. But the peace did not last long. By mid-morning, word had begun to spread through the village that the Duke himself had taken a personal interest in the story of the farm girl who had returned his prized horse, and curious neighbors began stopping by the orchard throughout the morning, eager to hear the full account directly from Clara herself, or simply to catch a glimpse of the young woman who had suddenly become the talk of Hollow Brook. Clara did her best to answer their questions patiently, though the constant interruptions made her work progress slower than usual, and by early afternoon she found herself wishing, not for the first time, that the previous day's events had unfolded with rather less attention than they had ultimately attracted. It was during one such interruption, as she spoke with a neighbor who had come to ask about the condition of Comet's injured leg, that Clara noticed a rider approaching along the road that bordered the orchard, moving at a measured pace that suggested purpose rather than urgency. She recognized the fine quality of the horse's tack even from a distance, and her stomach tightened slightly as she realized the rider was almost certainly connected to the previous day's events. The rider, a young man she did not recognize, dismounted at the edge of the orchard and approached with a respectful, formal bearing that immediately marked him as someone accustomed to serving within a grand household. "Miss Bennet?" he asked, glancing between Clara and the neighbor beside her. "Yes, that's me," Clara confirmed, setting down the basket she had been carrying. "I bring a message from Ashworth Hall," the young man explained, producing a folded piece of paper sealed with a small wax emblem that Clara did not recognize. "Mr. Whitmore asked that this be delivered to you personally." Clara accepted the letter with hands that trembled slightly, more from nervous anticipation than any real fear. She broke the seal carefully and unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the elegant, formal handwriting within. The message was brief, expressing continued gratitude for her actions the previous day and requesting, should it be convenient, that she might consider a visit to Ashworth Hall to discuss a matter that His Grace himself wished to raise with her personally. She read the message twice, uncertain she had understood it correctly the first time. A personal invitation from the Duke himself, requesting her presence at his estate. The very idea felt almost impossible to believe, and yet the paper in her hands, with its formal seal and elegant script, offered undeniable proof that it was entirely real. "Is there a reply you'd like me to carry back?" the young messenger asked, waiting patiently as Clara continued to stare at the letter. Clara glanced toward the neighbor beside her, who had gone entirely silent, clearly as stunned by the development as Clara herself. She thought of her father's earlier words, his caution about complications that might arise from all this unexpected attention, and wondered briefly whether she should discuss the matter with her parents before responding. But something in her decided, almost instinctively, that this was an opportunity she could not simply set aside without further consideration. Whatever the Duke wished to discuss, whatever possibility Whitmore had hinted toward the previous evening before catching himself, she found herself genuinely curious to learn more, rather than allowing the question to remain forever unanswered. "Please tell Mr. Whitmore that I would be honored to visit Ashworth Hall," Clara said finally, her voice steadier than she had expected. "I'll need to speak with my parents first, of course, but I see no reason to decline such a kind invitation." The messenger nodded, offering a small bow before remounting his horse. "I'll relay your response immediately. I imagine you'll receive word soon about arrangements for your visit." With that, he turned his horse back toward the road and departed at the same measured pace he had arrived with, leaving Clara standing amid her orchard trees, the letter still clutched in her hand, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and apprehension she had not felt in years. Her neighbor finally broke the silence, her expression somewhere between awe and disbelief. Clara Bennet, invited to Ashworth Hall itself. "I don't believe I've ever heard of such a thing happening to anyone in this village, not in all my years." Clara barely heard her, her mind already racing ahead toward the conversation she knew she needed to have with her parents, and toward the uncertain, exciting possibility of what might await her at the grand estate on the hill. Whatever her father's concerns about complications, whatever caution common sense might suggest, Clara found that she could not bring herself to regret the decision she had just made. She gathered her abandoned basket and made her way quickly back toward the farmhouse, the letter tucked carefully into the pocket of her apron, her thoughts already turning toward the questions she knew her parents would have, and toward the strange, unexpected turn her simple act of kindness had taken. Whatever waited for her at Ashworth Hall, she felt certain now that her life was about to change in ways she could not yet fully imagine, and despite the uncertainty of it all, a small, persistent flutter of excitement had begun to overshadow her earlier nervousness entirely. Clara's parents received the news of the invitation with a mixture of surprise and quiet apprehension that evening, gathered once again around the kitchen table as the letter sat between them, its wax seal catching the flickering candlelight. Margaret read it twice through, her fingers tracing the elegant script as though trying to divine some hidden meaning behind the formal words, while Henry sat back in his chair, arms crossed, his expression unusually thoughtful. "An invitation from His Grace himself," Margaret said finally, setting the letter down carefully. "I never imagined we'd see such a thing in our lifetime." "Nor did I," Henry admitted, "though I confess it does little to ease my earlier worries, Margaret. What could the Duke possibly wish to discuss with our daughter that requires a personal visit to his estate?" "Perhaps he simply wishes to thank her properly," Margaret suggested, though her tone lacked full conviction. "It would not be unreasonable for a man of his standing to want to express his gratitude in person, particularly given how valuable that horse must be to him." Clara listened to her parents' discussion with growing impatience, eager to voice her own thoughts on the matter. Whitmore mentioned something last night before he left with Comet. He started to say something about a possibility, then stopped himself and said it wasn't his place to offer on the Duke's behalf. I've wondered ever since what he meant. Henry's eyebrows rose at this new piece of information. "You didn't mention that last night." "I was too tired to think much of it at the time," Clara admitted. "But now, with this letter arriving today, I can't help but wonder if the two things are connected somehow." The family sat in thoughtful silence for a long moment, each turning the puzzle over in their own minds. Finally, Henry spoke again, his voice carrying a note of resignation mixed with cautious curiosity. "Well, whatever the reason, it seems clear enough that refusing the invitation would be neither practical nor wise. A duke does not extend such requests lightly, and declining might cause more complications than accepting ever could." "So you think I should go?" Clara asked. "I think you've already decided to go," Henry replied, a faint, knowing smile touching the corners of his mouth despite his earlier concerns. "I saw it in your eyes the moment you walked back into this house with that letter. You've never been one to leave a question unanswered, Clara, not since you were a small girl pestering me with questions about everything under the sun." Clara flushed slightly at her father's gentle teasing, though she could not deny the truth in his words. Margaret reached across the table and took her daughter's hand, her expression softening. "Just promise us you'll be careful, and that you'll remember who you are, whatever grand surroundings you might find yourself in. Fine houses and titled visitors don't change the good sense you were raised with." "I promise," Clara said sincerely, squeezing her mother's hand in return. Arrangements for the visit were finalized over the following days, with a formal reply sent back to Ashworth Hall confirming that Clara would arrive on the appointed morning. In the meantime, Clara continued her usual chores around the farm, though her thoughts frequently drifted toward the approaching visit, wondering what the grand estate might look like up close, and what the Duke himself might wish to discuss with her. Word of the impending visit spread through Hollow Brook almost as quickly as news of the horse's rescue had, and Clara found herself fielding an even greater number of questions and well-wishes from curious neighbors during the days leading up to her departure. Some offered genuine excitement and support, while others voiced quiet concerns similar to her father's earlier worries, cautioning her to remain wary of promises that grand households sometimes made and did not always keep. Clara appreciated the concern, even when it bordered on excessive caution, though she found herself unable to fully share in the anxiety that seemed to trouble some of her neighbors. Whatever awaited her at Ashworth Hall, she felt a growing sense of anticipation rather than dread, a curiosity about the world beyond her familiar village that she had never quite allowed herself to acknowledge before. The morning of her visit arrived clear and bright, the kind of early autumn day that carried a crispness in the air without yet threatening the harsher chill of the coming winter. Clara dressed carefully in her best clothes, a simple but neatly pressed dress that her mother had insisted on freshening the night before, and gathered her composure as best she could while waiting for the carriage that Whitmore had promised would arrive to carry her to the estate. The carriage, when it finally appeared along the road, was finer than anything Clara had ever ridden in before, its polished wood gleaming in the morning sunlight, drawn by a pair of matched horses that moved with the same elegant precision she remembered from Comet's own bearing. She climbed inside somewhat awkwardly, unused to such luxury, and settled onto the cushioned seat as the carriage set off smoothly toward the northern road. The journey to Ashworth Hall took nearly an hour, though the time passed quickly as Clara watched the passing countryside through the carriage window, the familiar fields and farms of Hollow Brook gradually giving way to more manicured landscapes as they drew closer to the estate. Eventually, the grand house itself came into view, rising above its surrounding gardens with an imposing elegance that took Clara's breath away despite having glimpsed it from a distance many times before. Ashworth Hall was even more magnificent up close than she had imagined, its pale stone walls catching the morning light, tall windows reflecting the surrounding gardens like sheets of polished silver. The carriage rolled up a long, gravel drive lined with carefully tended hedges, eventually coming to a stop before a grand entrance where several members of the household staff already stood waiting. Whitmore himself stepped forward as the carriage door opened, offering Clara a respectful bow as she stepped down onto the gravel drive, her legs feeling somewhat unsteady beneath her, though whether from the journey or her growing nervousness she could not quite say. "Miss Bennet, welcome to Ashworth Hall. His Grace is most eager to speak with you." "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Whitmore," Clara replied, doing her best to keep her voice steady despite the overwhelming grandeur surrounding her on every side. "I must admit, I've never seen anything quite like this before." Whitmore's expression softened slightly at her honest admission, a hint of genuine warmth breaking through his usual formal composure. "Few have, Miss Bennet, though few have earned the privilege of a personal audience with His Grace either. Please follow me. Comet has been asking after you, or so I imagine, given how much better his spirits have seemed since his return." Clara smiled at that, genuine pleasure breaking through her nervousness at the thought that the horse might still remember her, even fondly, after their brief but meaningful time together. She followed Whitmore through the grand entrance hall, her eyes struggling to take in every detail of the magnificent surroundings, from the polished marble floors to the elegant portraits lining the walls, each depicting figures from what she assumed must be generations of the Duke's family. They passed through several long corridors before Whitmore finally paused before a set of tall, ornately carved doors, glancing back at Clara with an expression that seemed to carry both reassurance and quiet anticipation. "His Grace awaits you within. There is no need for nervousness, Miss Bennet. He is a fair and thoughtful man, whatever grandeur might surround him." With that, Whitmore pushed open the doors, revealing a spacious study lined with towering bookshelves, sunlight streaming through tall windows that overlooked the estate's expansive gardens. And there, standing near the window with his back initially turned toward the door, stood a figure whose bearing immediately marked him as someone of significant importance, even before he turned to reveal his face. The Duke of Ashworth was younger than Clara had expected, perhaps only a decade or so older than herself, with dark hair and an expression that carried more warmth and genuine curiosity than the cold, distant formality she had imagined based on the village's whispered stories about him. He turned fully as she entered, and for a moment, his eyes met hers with an intensity that made Clara's breath catch slightly in her throat. "Miss Bennet," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that immediately eased some of her lingering nervousness. "Thank you for accepting my invitation. I have been eager to meet the young woman who showed such remarkable kindness toward my horse, and such evident skill in calming an animal known throughout my household for his difficult temperament." Clara offered a small, respectful curtsy, uncertain of the proper etiquette for such an unexpected meeting, but determined to conduct herself with as much grace as she could manage. "Your Grace, I only did what seemed right at the time. Comet was frightened and hurt, and I couldn't simply leave him to wander alone." The Duke's expression softened further at her words, and he gestured toward a pair of comfortable chairs positioned near the window, inviting her to sit. "That is precisely the quality that has drawn my interest, Miss Bennet. Kindness offered without expectation of reward is a rare thing indeed, particularly among those who might have simply passed by, assuming the matter to be none of their concern." As Clara settled into the offered chair, still somewhat overwhelmed by her surroundings and the unexpected warmth of the Duke's welcome, she found herself increasingly curious about the true purpose behind his invitation. Whatever formal gratitude he might wish to express, she sensed, even in these first few moments, that something more significant lay behind his desire to meet with her personally. The Duke took his own seat across from her, studying her for a long moment with an expression that seemed to carry genuine thoughtfulness rather than mere formality. "Miss Bennet, I must confess that my invitation carries a purpose beyond simple gratitude, though that gratitude is genuine and considerable. There is a matter I wish to discuss with you, one that I believe might interest you a great deal, should you be willing to hear me out." Clara's heart quickened at his words, the earlier curiosity that had followed her since Whitmore's unfinished sentence the previous evening now returning with renewed intensity. "I would be glad to hear whatever you wish to discuss, Your Grace." The Duke nodded, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth as he leaned forward slightly in his chair, clearly preparing to explain the true purpose behind the invitation that had brought Clara to his grand estate on this bright autumn morning. "My stables have long been a source of both pride and frustration for me, Miss Bennet," the Duke began, folding his hands together as he spoke. "I keep some of the finest horses in the region, animals bred for speed, strength, and beauty, gathered from across the country and beyond. Yet fine breeding alone does not guarantee an easy temperament, and several of my most valuable animals, Comet chief among them, have proven notoriously difficult for even my most experienced handlers to manage." Clara listened attentively, uncertain where this explanation might be leading but genuinely curious to understand more about the world the Duke inhabited, so different from her own quiet life in Hollow Brook. "When Comet went missing yesterday morning," the Duke continued, "my head groom informed me that the horse had grown increasingly agitated in recent weeks, difficult to saddle, prone to sudden fright at the smallest disturbance. We suspect now that something startled him badly enough to cause his escape, though we may never know exactly what. What matters more to me, Miss Bennet, is what happened after his escape, when he found himself alone, injured, and frightened in unfamiliar territory." "He was very afraid when I first found him," Clara confirmed. "It took some time before he trusted me enough to let me approach." "And yet approach you did, and calm him you did, in a matter of minutes rather than the hours my own experienced staff often require," the Duke observed, his tone carrying genuine admiration. "Whitmore relayed to me not only the account of how you found and returned Comet, but also his own observations of the ease and confidence with which you handled him throughout the encounter at the village. Such natural skill, Miss Bennet, is exceedingly rare, and exceedingly valuable to a household such as mine. Clara felt a flush of surprised pleasure at his words, though she remained uncertain exactly where this conversation was heading. I've always had a way with animals, Your Grace, though I've never thought of it as anything particularly special. It simply comes naturally to me. That is precisely what makes it valuable, the Duke replied. Skills that come naturally, that cannot be easily taught or trained into someone who lacks the inherent gift, are the rarest and most precious of all. I have spent considerable sums over the years hiring and training stable staff, only to find that few possess the particular temperament required to manage horses as spirited as Comet, without resorting to methods I find distasteful and often counterproductive. He paused, studying Clara with an expression that carried both genuine respect and careful consideration, as though weighing his next words with particular care. I would like to offer you a position within my household, Miss Bennet, working alongside my stable staff, with particular responsibility for Comet and several of my other more spirited animals. The position would come with fair wages, comfortable accommodations here at the estate should you wish them, and the opportunity to develop your natural talents under the guidance of my most experienced handlers. Clara sat in stunned silence for a long moment, the offer far exceeding anything she had imagined might come from her simple act of kindness the previous day. She had expected, at most, perhaps a modest reward, a token of gratitude that she could bring home to her family. The idea of an actual position within the Duke's household, working with horses of such extraordinary breeding, felt almost too remarkable to fully comprehend. Your Grace, she said finally, her voice carrying genuine uncertainty, I am deeply honored by your offer, truly, but my family depends on me at our farm. My parents are not young, and the orchard requires considerable work throughout the year. I'm not certain I could simply leave them to take up a position here, however generous the offer might be. The Duke nodded, his expression showing no surprise at her hesitation, as though he had anticipated such concerns from the moment he first considered making the offer. I understand your loyalty to your family, Miss Bennet, and I would not ask you to abandon your responsibilities to them. Perhaps we might find an arrangement that honors both your obligations at home and the opportunity I am offering here. You might work at the estate several days each week, returning to your family's farm for the remainder, or perhaps we could arrange additional support for your family's orchard to ease the burden your absence might otherwise create. Clara considered his words carefully, genuinely touched by his evident willingness to accommodate her concerns rather than simply expecting her to abandon her family entirely for the sake of his offer. That is very generous, Your Grace. I would need to discuss such an arrangement with my parents before giving you a definite answer, if that would be acceptable. Of course, the Duke agreed readily. This is not a decision to be made hastily, nor one that should be made without proper consideration of your family's needs and wishes. Take whatever time you require, Miss Bennet. My offer will remain open, whether you decide to accept immediately or after further reflection. Their conversation continued for some time after that, the Duke asking further questions about her experience with animals, her family's circumstances, and her own hopes and interests beyond the immediate matter of his offer. Clara found herself increasingly at ease as their discussion progressed, the Duke's genuine warmth and thoughtful attention gradually dissolving much of the nervousness that had accompanied her arrival at the grand estate. Eventually, Whitmore returned to escort Clara toward the stables, at the Duke's suggestion, so that she might see Comet once more and observe firsthand the conditions and staff she would be working alongside should she ultimately accept the offered position. The stables, when they reached them, proved every bit as impressive as the main house itself, a long, well-maintained building housing what appeared to be dozens of horses, each stall marked with careful attention to cleanliness and comfort. Comet's stall stood near the center of the building, and the horse's ears pricked forward immediately at the sound of Clara's approaching footsteps, his head turning eagerly toward the sound of her voice as she greeted him warmly. The wound on his leg, she noted with satisfaction, had already been properly cleaned and dressed, showing clear signs of healing under the estate's skilled care. He remembers you, observed an older man who approached from further down the stable, his weathered face and calloused hands marking him immediately as an experienced horseman. Been unusually calm since yesterday evening, which is more than I can say for most of the time he's been in our care. This is Old Ben, Whitmore explained, head groom here at Ashworth Hall and the man responsible for managing our stables these past 20 years. Old Ben studied Clara with evident interest, his sharp eyes taking in her easy familiarity with Comet as she reached up to stroke the horse's nose. His Grace tells me you might be joining our staff, Miss Bennet. I'll admit I was skeptical when I first heard the suggestion, given how young you are and how little formal training you've had with horses of Comet's breeding. But watching you with him now, I begin to understand what caught His Grace's attention so thoroughly. I haven't yet decided whether to accept the position, Clara clarified. I need to discuss it with my family first. Wise decision, Old Ben nodded approvingly. Though I'll say this much, whatever you decide, skill like yours doesn't come along often, and it would be a shame to see it wasted tending apple trees when horses like these could benefit so greatly from your care. Clara smiled at his blunt but genuine assessment, spending some additional time exploring the stables and meeting several other members of the staff before Whitmore eventually escorted her back toward the waiting carriage that would return her home. As they walked, Whitmore offered his own thoughts on the potential position, careful never to pressure her decision but clearly hopeful that she might ultimately choose to accept the Duke's offer. The carriage ride home passed in a blur of thoughtful consideration, Clara's mind turning over every aspect of the remarkable morning she had just experienced. By the time the familiar sight of her family's farmhouse came into view, she had already begun composing, in her mind, the explanation she would offer her parents about the extraordinary opportunity now before them, uncertain still of what their reaction might ultimately be, but eager nonetheless to share the full, remarkable story of everything that had unfolded since Comet had first burst through the trees of their orchard, setting into motion a chain of events that none of them could have possibly anticipated just 2 short days before. Clara's parents listened with growing astonishment as she recounted every detail of her visit to Ashworth Hall that evening, seated once again around the familiar kitchen table where so much of the family's important conversations had taken place over the years. Margaret's hands remained pressed together throughout much of the story, as though holding herself steady against the sheer improbability of what her daughter was describing, while Henry leaned forward with an intensity that suggested he was weighing every word with careful, practical consideration. A position within the Duke's own household, Margaret repeated, once Clara had finished explaining the offer in full. Working with his finest horses and wages besides. Clara, this is beyond anything I ever imagined might come from finding a lost horse in our orchard. It is a generous offer, Henry agreed, though his tone carried the same cautious weight it had held since the beginning of this entire unexpected affair. But generous offers from powerful men often come with complications that aren't immediately apparent, Clara. I want to understand fully what this arrangement would actually mean for you, and for this family. Clara nodded, appreciating her father's careful consideration even as she felt a flutter of impatience at the thought of further delay. The Duke said I wouldn't need to abandon my responsibilities here. He suggested I might work at the estate several days each week, returning home for the rest, or that he might provide additional help for the orchard to ease whatever burden my time away might create. And what would this work actually involve? Henry pressed further. You'd be handling horses far more valuable and far more dangerous than anything we keep here. What happens if something goes wrong, if one of these animals injures you, or worse? Old Ben, the head groom, has managed those stables for 20 years, Clara replied. I wouldn't be working alone or without guidance. And your Grace himself seemed genuinely concerned with finding an arrangement that would work well for everyone involved, not simply taking advantage of what happened with Comet. Margaret reached across the table, placing her hand gently over her husband's. Henry, I understand your concerns, truly I do, but listen to how our daughter speaks of this opportunity. I haven't seen such life in her voice in a long while. Perhaps this is simply meant to be, a gift that came from her own good heart being recognized and rewarded in a way none of us could have anticipated. Henry sat in thoughtful silence for a long moment, studying his daughter's hopeful expression before finally sighing, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. I won't stand in the way of an opportunity like this, Clara, not if it's truly what you want. But I want you to promise me you'll be careful, that you'll trust your own judgment if anything about this arrangement ever feels wrong, regardless of how grand the household or how kind the Duke himself might seem. I promise, Father, Clara said sincerely, relief flooding through her at his cautious but genuine blessing. And I truly believe this could be good for all of us, not just for me. The family discussed practical matters late into the evening, considering how Clara's potential absence several days each week might affect the orchard's ongoing needs, and what arrangements might need to be made to ensure her parents were not left struggling with additional burdens in her absence. By the time they finally retired for the night, a tentative plan had begun to take shape, one that Clara felt confident she could present to the Duke when she returned her formal answer. The following morning, Clara composed a careful letter accepting the Duke's generous offer, outlining the arrangement her family had discussed and expressing her genuine gratitude for his willingness to accommodate her responsibilities at home. She entrusted the letter to a village messenger bound for the northern road, and spent the remainder of the day in a state of nervous anticipation, uncertain how quickly a response might arrive or what final arrangements might still need to be settled before she could formally begin her new position. The response came more swiftly than she had expected, arriving the very next afternoon in the form of another visit from Whitmore himself, who brought with him not only confirmation of the arrangement Clara had proposed, but also additional details about compensation, accommodations, and the specific responsibilities she would hold within the estate's stables. His Grace was most pleased to receive your acceptance, Whitmore explained, seated once again at the Bennet family's kitchen table, a location that had come to feel increasingly significant given the momentous conversations it had recently hosted. He has asked me to convey his personal thanks, and to assure your family that every effort will be made to ensure this arrangement benefits everyone involved. He proceeded to outline the details of Clara's new position with careful precision, explaining that she would work at the estate 3 days each week, focusing primarily on Comet and several other horses whose temperaments had proven challenging for the regular stable staff. Her wages, generous by any standard familiar to the Bennet family, would provide meaningful additional income, while the Duke had also arranged for a young farmhand from a neighboring property to assist with the orchard's needs on the days Clara would be occupied at the estate, ensuring her family would not be left short-handed during her absence. "This is more generous than we could have hoped for," Margaret said, genuine gratitude evident in her voice as Whitmore finished his explanation. "His Grace believes strongly in rewarding genuine kindness and rare talent," Whitmore replied. "He does not see this arrangement as mere charity, but as a mutually beneficial partnership. Your daughter's skill with horses is a genuine asset to our household, one that will serve both his stables and, I suspect, her own future considerably well." The remaining details were settled quickly, with Clara agreeing to begin her new position the following week, allowing sufficient time for her family to finalize arrangements for the orchard's ongoing care during her scheduled absences. As Whitmore prepared to depart, he offered Clara one final observation that lingered in her thoughts long after his carriage had disappeared back down the road toward Ashworth Hall. "His Grace mentioned, before I departed, that he hopes you might consider this position not merely as employment, but as the beginning of something more significant. He does not often find individuals whose natural instincts align so closely with his own vision for how the estate's animals ought to be treated and understood. I suspect, Miss Bennet, that your role here may grow considerably beyond its current scope, should your talents prove as remarkable as his initial impression suggests." Clara turned the steward's words over carefully in her mind throughout the following days, wondering what he might have meant by suggesting her role could grow beyond its initial scope, and whether the Duke himself harbored intentions that extended even further than the generous position he had already offered. She tried not to let her imagination run too far ahead of the practical reality before her, focusing instead on preparing herself for the genuine work that awaited her at the estate's stables. Her first day at Ashworth Hall arrived with a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded her, in some ways, of the anxious anticipation she had felt during her initial visit to meet the Duke himself. Old Ben greeted her warmly at the stable entrance, immediately putting her to work alongside the regular staff, observing her interactions with the various horses under his care with the careful, evaluating eye of a man determined to see for himself whether the Duke's confidence in this unlikely new addition to his household was truly warranted. Clara proved herself quickly, her natural instincts guiding her through interactions with even the most notoriously difficult horses, with a patience and understanding that continued to impress the estate's experienced staff. Comet, in particular, showed a marked improvement in temperament whenever Clara worked with him, his earlier skittishness gradually giving way to a calm trust that even old Ben admitted he had rarely witnessed develop so quickly between horse and handler. Word of her success spread quickly through the estate's household, and it was not long before the Duke himself began making regular visits to the stables during Clara's scheduled days, ostensibly to check on Comet's continued progress, though the frequency and duration of these visits gradually suggested a growing interest that extended beyond mere professional curiosity about his horse's welfare. Clara noticed the pattern herself, though she said little about it to anyone beyond her own private thoughts, uncertain what to make of the Duke's evident enjoyment of their conversations, which increasingly touched on subjects far removed from horses and stable management. He asked about her family, her hopes for the future, her thoughts on matters ranging from the management of the estate's surrounding lands to broader questions about fairness and responsibility that seemed to genuinely interest him beyond simple polite conversation. Their growing acquaintance developed slowly over the following weeks, marked by easy conversation during quiet moments in the stables, and gradually, Clara found herself looking forward to her days at Ashworth Hall not merely for the satisfaction of working with the horses she had come to genuinely love, but for the pleasure of the Duke's increasingly frequent company as well, a development she had not anticipated when she first accepted his generous offer of employment. Autumn deepened into the first cold days of winter, and Clara's presence at Ashworth Hall had become such a familiar sight that the household staff no longer paused to remark on the sight of the farm girl who had once wandered into their midst with a lost horse in tow. She had earned genuine respect among the stable workers, her skill with even the most difficult animals continuing to impress everyone who witnessed her quiet, patient methods, and her growing friendship with the Duke himself had become an accepted, if quietly discussed, feature of daily life at the grand estate. Clara herself remained somewhat uncertain about the true nature of that friendship, aware that something had shifted gradually over the passing weeks, though she found it difficult to name exactly what that shift represented. The Duke's visits to the stables had grown more frequent, their conversations lengthier and increasingly personal, touching on hopes and fears and private thoughts that Clara suspected he shared with very few others within his grand, but sometimes isolating position in life. It was during one such conversation, on a crisp afternoon as the first light snow of the season began drifting down outside the stable doors, that the Duke finally addressed the growing warmth between them directly, his usual composed formality giving way to something more genuine and vulnerable than Clara had witnessed from him before. "Miss Bennet," he began, standing beside her as she finished brushing down Comet's coat, "I find myself in an unusual position, one I confess I did not anticipate when I first offered you employment within my household." Clara paused her work, turning to face him with curious attention. "What position is that, Your Grace?" "I find that I look forward to your days here with an eagerness that extends well beyond my interest in my horse's welfare," he admitted, a rare uncertainty coloring his usually confident tone. Our conversations have come to mean a great deal to me, Miss Bennet, more than I initially expected when this arrangement began. I find myself wondering whether you might share, even in some small measure, similar feelings toward our growing acquaintance. Clara felt her heart quicken at his words, the same flutter of nervous anticipation she remembered from her very first visit to the grand estate returning with renewed intensity. I have valued our conversations as well, Your Grace, more than I quite know how to express, if I'm honest. The Duke's expression softened with evident relief at her admission, and for a long moment neither spoke, the quiet stable filled only with the soft sounds of horses shifting in their stalls and the gentle patter of snow against the roof above them. I understand that the difference in our stations presents genuine complications, he continued eventually. I am aware that society holds certain expectations about such matters, expectations that neither of us can simply ignore, however much we might wish otherwise. But I find myself, Miss Bennet, genuinely unwilling to let those expectations dictate the course of feelings that have developed so honestly between us. Clara considered his words carefully, aware of the significant complications such a connection might present, not only for herself, but for the Duke as well, given his position and the expectations surely placed upon him by his family and his standing within society. I share your concerns about such complications, Your Grace, truly. But I find that I, too, am unwilling to dismiss what has grown between us simply because it does not fit neatly within expected boundaries. Their conversation continued for some time that afternoon, both acknowledging the genuine challenges that lay ahead should they choose to pursue the connection that had developed so unexpectedly between them, yet neither willing to simply abandon feelings that had grown so naturally from an initial act of simple kindness. The Duke made clear that he had no intention of rushing any decision, understanding fully that Clara would need time to consider what such a connection might mean for her own life and her family's expectations, just as he himself would need to navigate the complex expectations of his own position and family. Over the following months, their relationship developed gradually and carefully, marked by continued visits and conversations that deepened the genuine affection between them, while both remained mindful of the practical complications that any more formal connection would inevitably bring. Clara's family, initially cautious about the growing closeness between their daughter and a man so far above their own modest station, gradually came to see the genuine respect and care the Duke showed toward Clara, easing much of their earlier concern. The wider village, too, followed the unfolding story with continued fascination, the tale of the farm girl who had found the Duke's lost horse evolving over time into something that felt increasingly like the beginning of an entirely different kind of story altogether, one that captured the imagination of everyone who had followed the remarkable turn of events since that autumn afternoon, when Comet had first burst through the trees of the Bennet family's orchard. Spring arrived with its usual gradual warming, the orchard trees Clara had tended throughout her childhood beginning to bud once more with new growth. And it was during this season of renewal that the Duke finally approached Henry and Margaret Bennet directly, requesting their blessing for a more formal courtship of their daughter, one that he hoped, in time, might lead toward a lasting commitment between them. Henry, who had watched the relationship develop with careful attention over the preceding months, found himself genuinely satisfied by the sincerity and respect the Duke had consistently shown toward his daughter throughout their growing acquaintance. He granted his blessing readily, and Margaret, who had perhaps suspected this outcome even before Clara herself fully recognized where her feelings were leading, welcomed the news with genuine joy. Clara herself felt a profound sense of gratitude as she reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this point, beginning with nothing more than the simple, instinctive decision to help a frightened, injured animal, rather than turning away and assuming the matter to be none of her concern. That single act of kindness, offered without any expectation of reward or recognition, had ultimately led her toward a life, and a connection she could never have imagined on that ordinary autumn afternoon when she first heard hoofbeats crashing through the trees of her family's orchard. The formal courtship that followed unfolded with the same careful, genuine warmth that had characterized their relationship from its earliest beginnings. And as the seasons continued to turn, it became increasingly clear to everyone who knew them that this connection, born from such an unexpected and humble beginning, had grown into something genuinely lasting and true. Clara continued her work within the estate's stables throughout this time, unwilling to abandon the skills and responsibilities that had first brought her into the Duke's life, finding in this arrangement a rare and precious balance between her own independent talents and the deepening bond she shared with the man who had come to value her not for her station in life, but for the genuine goodness of her character and the rare gift she possessed for understanding creatures, human and animal alike, with patience, kindness, and an honesty that never wavered, regardless of the grandeur or humility of the circumstances surrounding her. By the following autumn, exactly 1 year after Comet had first bolted through the trees near the Bennet family orchard, Ashworth Hall prepared for a celebration unlike any the estate had hosted in living memory. Word had traveled far beyond Hollow Brook by then, carried through neighboring villages and market towns, of the farm girl who had once found a lost horse without knowing its owner's name, and who now stood on the verge of becoming part of the very household she had unknowingly served that day. Clara stood once more in the orchard where everything had begun, gathering apples much as she had on that fateful afternoon, though everything about her circumstances had changed so profoundly that the memory sometimes felt like it belonged to a different life entirely. Comet grazed contentedly nearby in a paddock her father had built specially at the Duke's request, allowed to roam freely between the estate and the humble orchard where his rescue had first taken place, a living symbol of the unlikely connection that had brought two such different worlds together. Margaret watched her daughter from the farmhouse porch, her heart swelling with a pride she had never fully expected to feel, remembering the anxious evening when Clara had first walked home late, exhausted from her long journey with a stranger's horse, uncertain what complications her kindness might bring. Henry, working nearby with the additional help the Duke had arranged for the orchard, paused often to watch his daughter with quiet satisfaction, grateful that his earlier caution had never once been proven necessary throughout the entire remarkable year. The wedding preparations brought together both worlds that Clara now called her own, the simple, warm traditions of Hollow Brook blending carefully with the grandeur expected of an estate as significant as Ashworth Hall. Villagers who had once merely watched from a curious distance now found themselves invited guests, their earlier whispered speculation replaced by genuine warmth and celebration for the young woman whose kindness had changed not only her own life, but had brought a renewed sense of connection between the grand estate and the humble village that had always existed in its shadow. On the morning of the ceremony, Clara stood once more near the edge of the orchard, this time dressed in a gown far finer than anything she had ever imagined wearing, waiting for the carriage that would carry her toward the church where her family and the Duke's own relations had gathered to witness the joining of two lives that had begun so improbably with a frightened horse, and an act of simple, unhesitating kindness. As she climbed into the carriage, she caught sight of Comet one final time before departing, his gray coat gleaming in the morning light, his ears pricked forward attentively as though he, too, understood the significance of the day unfolding around them. Clara smiled at the sight, remembering the frightened, injured animal she had first encountered tangled in the brambles at the edge of these very trees, and marveling at how far both of them had traveled since that unremarkable autumn afternoon that had, in truth, changed everything. The ceremony itself passed in a warm blur of familiar and unfamiliar faces, of her mother's proud tears and her father's quiet, satisfied smile, of old Ben's gruff but genuine well-wishes and Whitmore's formal, yet clearly heartfelt congratulations. The Duke, standing beside her as they exchanged their vows, seemed to Clara in that moment not as the grand, distant figure the village had once whispered about with cautious respect, but simply as the man she had come to know and love through months of honest conversation and shared understanding, a man whose genuine character had revealed itself gradually, much as her own had revealed itself to him, through patience, kindness, and the simple willingness to see beyond the surface of circumstance, toward the truth of who someone genuinely was. In the years that followed, the story of how Clara Bennett had brought back a lost horse without knowing its owner's name, only to find the Duke himself arriving at her door before evening had fully settled, became something of a beloved legend throughout the region, told and retold by parents to children as an example of how genuine kindness, offered freely and without expectation of reward, might carry consequences far beyond anything the giver could ever have anticipated. Clara herself never tired of the story, though she always insisted, whenever asked to recount it, that she had done nothing particularly remarkable that autumn afternoon, only what any decent person would have done upon finding a frightened, injured creature in need of help. Yet those who knew her best understood that it was precisely this humble, unassuming nature, this genuine and instinctive kindness that expected nothing in return, that had made all the difference in a story that might otherwise have ended quite differently. Had she been someone else, someone less patient, less willing to sacrifice an afternoon and walk miles from home for the sake of a stranger's frightened animal, the remarkable chain of events that followed might never have unfolded at all. And so the orchard remained, through all the years that followed, a place of particular significance to Clara, now Duchess of Ashworth, a place she returned to often, sometimes with her own children in later years, to tell them the story of how their mother had once found a lost horse running wild through these very trees, and how that single, simple act of kindness had, quite unexpectedly, changed the entire course of her life, bringing her a love and a purpose she could never have imagined on that ordinary autumn afternoon when everything, quite without warning, had begun to change.